friends, and welcome back to Club, podcast from Seed Club. My name is Jess Sloss, your host, and today I'm joined by one of my favorite people in the world, Nicole, who runs things here at Seed Club, leads our Accelerator program, and over the last little while, we've had a number of opportunities to share a little bit more about what the Seed Club Accelerator is all about, what our intentions are, and how she approaches designing and building what we hope to be a industry-defining and leading accelerator program. We've had a really great response to those conversations, and I thought I'd take an opportunity to hopefully dive a little bit deeper here with her. We shine some light on some of the cool things we've been up to at Seed Club within the past 6 months, and more specifically, take a deep dive into what the Accelerator program is and what it has to offer. In this episode, Nicole shares her story of entering crypto and the journey that she's been on so far. And then we get into a little bit of philosophizing around the future and how we hope the space will evolve. A little bit of a different conversation than we've had over the last few weeks, but I'm sure you'll enjoy it nonetheless. So let's jump into it. Hello, Nicole.
Hey, Jess. How's it going?
Good. I love that we're talking midday Tuesday in the midst of the craziness that is our lives within Seed Club. And I think maybe no better backdrop to frame this conversation about the Seed Club Accelerator and the work that you've been doing here with us than with that craziness, being on calls all day, being in the midst of product launches and token launches and hiring and structuring, etc. So that's really what I want to talk to you about. I feel like, we've had a number of people on this podcast that are off doing other things, doing cool, interesting things, working in deep areas that are obviously very aligned with what we're doing, whether it's community or, thinking about the future of DAOs. But I thought we could use this time together to kind of turn our focus a little bit inwards and shine a bit of a flashlight on kind of some of the cool things that we've been doing in Seed Club and specifically on the Accelerator, because as you know, probably one of the most asked questions is like, what the heck do you guys actually do? What is it? Should I be a part of it? And, since it is such a core thing that we're doing at Seed Club and we don't talk about it a lot, there's a small number of people who've actually experienced it. I thought maybe a little bit of background, a little exploration on how we're thinking about it could be useful to at least some people who are listening. So, big long preamble. I also want people to know you more because you're doing incredible work here. And I think a lot of it is sort of under the radar. So can you maybe just spend a couple minutes here introducing yourself? Who are you, Nicole?
Sure thing, Jess. Thank you. Yeah, so I am the educator at Seed Club. I run the Accelerator amongst random and fun projects. Shout out Pool Suite. Coming up on about a year since I lost my job due to the pandemic, actually. So that's been kind of a crazy point to reflect on. And I don't know, almost about 6 months, I guess, ish, of Seed Club, which, I don't know, that feels like an eternity also.
People get to see this look on her face as it just dawned on her that she lived 10 years in the last 6 months working with us here at Seed Club.
6 months of anything in crypto is, it's about 10 years. So, wow, it's flown by. It feels like both like a day and 10 years somehow concurrently. So, LFG.
So, I want to get into a bit of that experience, but I think you've been in and around the crypto space through this sort of creative lens for years, right? So, can you maybe, you're talking about on a call earlier about your early crypto creative trauma. Do you want to maybe give us a bit of backstory on what you were working on before you kind of came into the space again?
Yeah, so I was at Berklee College of Music doing a couple things at the same time. I ran their Creative Entrepreneurship Institute, so working with musicians to explore how the musical mindset and the entrepreneurial journey overlap and are complementary and how they can use that to their benefit. And then on top of that, in working with musicians, we saw that the industry was, in general, fairly broken. And by looking at metadata and payment streams and ways to make that more efficient, accurate, and expedient, that we could have a big impact on artists' livelihoods. Because that looks like a supply chain and a bunch of databases, no surprise. This is 2016, 2017, crypto got introduced. And so that's where I got to meet a lot of the current folks that are still playing in the space, and where, for better or for worse, definitely for better, I got crypto pilled and started falling into this rabbit hole where I find myself now.
I'm assuming it feels different today than it did back then. And I'm wondering, Like, yeah, how would you articulate that difference?
Yeah, it almost feels like the sort of, Stranger Things upside down world, or like, bizarro world as far as how we're looking at problem solving. Because I think that a lot of that time, I mean, there was kind of two sides, and I was very much focused and within sort of the more supply chain metadata side of crypto. And I know that there was a ton of ICO and CryptoKitties and NFT projects that were happening. And for the most part, those worlds weren't really talking and didn't even seem to be able to, walk and chew gum at the same time. And then on top of that, it was really more about how can we take this interoperable, non-siloed database technology and overlay it on top of a world where every single entity has their own database. And that, because of all sorts of entrenchment within the music industry, large enterprises, et cetera, just ended up being super NGMI and just not working, and leading to a lot of people basically beating their heads against brick walls. A lot of the people that I think saw where we were going to be today, but weren't able to communicate that to people that were very much stuck in this sort of entrenched, this is how IP works, this is how music goes from artist to fan, and this is how it will always work. And I feel like we have left that model, and the projects that are the most successful in music, and I think are now influencing other projects, basically just completely stepped out of that sandbox and created a different sandbox. And that sandbox is more fun and more interesting and much more successful.
Yeah, I think back to just some of like the early projects that we've seen come through, or at least have been formative in this community DAO space. And I think, music is a big vertical there. I heard this from many people, even around something like like Songcamp, or, say Jump, two early projects within the C Club ecosystem, where people were like, is that even a thing? Who's going to go do that? Like, why are you so bullish on the success of these things? There was obviously some energy, but we're talking about hundreds, not thousands, definitely not tens of thousands or millions of people involved in these things. And I think what's hard to see, and I think maybe still is hard to see, is just how important freedom to build from scratch and from nothing is in this new space. And if you think about some of the more successful projects in the space, they're just people saying, hey, we're going to go do it and do it this way. And there wasn't any legacy attachment to it whatsoever. They're being done, FWB or Whale or, Songcamp, they're all just being done by people and people are sort of building their own momentum in their own worlds and not asking for permission. And so I think to do that from an existing IP holder or entity, like we're not seeing that because there's a lot of entrenched needs and risk aversion. But for a guy like Matthew at Songcamp, he's like, I just want to go do something cool with a bunch of friends, so let's go. And what we're seeing is just like the leverage that can come from that, right? Like when you mentioned Pool Suite earlier, that's literally a project that started by Marty and some friends that were like, hey, this would be kind of cool, 7 years ago, and just kept having fun at it. And then all of a sudden it steps into Web3, and Diplo tweets about it today, and it just goes crazy. So Diplo tweeted about it today, Nicole, I'm not sure if you saw that.
Did not know that, but go Pool Suite.
Of course, right? That's maybe a good transition into what we're doing here at C Club with the Accelerator. I always love asking people this question. If you're to describe the C Club Accelerator to your mom or to somebody who's not within our world, how are you doing that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the super tagline answer is Y Combinator within Web3, but I think that there's some pieces that port over really well, and I think we're seeing that there's some things that we have unique superpowers. You often talk about this communal sense making, and that has been a huge unlock. Seeing the pace that communities learn at has astounded me at how we're all learning more quickly together. And so I think that that's another piece of it, is we're coming together, learning really quickly together, and then building successfully together. So the Accelerator obviously takes in communities and projects and helps them accelerate or build towards a goal. And within Seed Club, of course, that's becoming a tokenized community or exploring the use of social tokens and DAOs.
We talked about skeuomorphism quite a bit, and like this being able to sort of differentiate between like what is different about what we're trying to build here versus maybe traditional accelerators. which I think is interesting. But maybe just to start on like the things that are the same, and just to be clear, projects that we work with, so we recruit projects, we choose which projects we want to work with. Those projects come in and engage with us through a 6-week program, and then we support them beyond that to grow into hopefully extremely valuable, powerful, amazing examples of these community DAOs that we're so passionate about. The fundamental sort of mechanism or business model around it is that teams contribute a percentage of their tokens to the C Club treasury for participation and for the support that we give them over the lifetime, which sort of aligns our interests to be long-term minded and to create a network that creates a ton of value into the future. So that's, I think, somewhat similar to what a traditional accelerator would be like, but I guess the notable difference is like we're not contributing capital to these teams. So teams are becoming a part of our network, getting access to the whole host of talent and connections and support and tools that we were able to bring to the table. So that's one. And then two, they, instead of investment, they get an ownership stake in C Club. So they actually, once successfully launched, get club tokens, which represent ownership in the C Club network. And so instead of it being an investment of cash, teams are successful with us, they get a stake in the broader network. And hopefully that creates this dynamic of co-creation moving forward, where projects that are successful with us today help support projects that will be successful in the future. And I think one of the core ways I've been trying to frame this is this idea of like, accelerators like YC 500 startups, et cetera, or like the accelerators of the era of the firm. And what we're trying to build is like an accelerator that's a network. So in the network era, in the DAO era, what does an accelerator look like? I'm curious if you agree with that framing or if there's anything you'd want to add there.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's, like you said, the framing and the skeleton, perhaps there's a lot of similarities. I think that you could sort of look at them together and, just fundamentally they might appear very similar, where you come in, there's an intensive learning model for a portion of time, and then you go off and there's continuous support and there is some type of capital exchange, although I think that that's a pretty meaningful difference that you noted, that, we're looking at percentages of tokens versus infusion of capital. I think that once you dig in a little bit deeper, the ways that we're doing this, and I think that the types of the conversations that we're having, so like sort of what's within that container, or frame, is where it becomes really different. And I think that a lot of models within Web3 start to have these very sort of organic, fractal, interconnected, beautiful minds types of maps where you see what the support networks and the learning networks look like. And so you've got these interconnected circles and chains of the projects coming in and then cycling back and supporting each other. And so I think we saw that with SCO2 and SCO3, where Jump and Protein and individuals from some of the other SCO2 projects were leaning in and supporting these projects within SCO3. And then the fact that now we've graduated folks like Creator Cabins and Kraus and so many other projects that are right on that brink of becoming uber successful. Refraction, Eve Wealth, All Ships. I mean, so many. So having only been in the third accelerator and seeing this network effect of each one being able to support the teaching and learning for accelerators to come, I think is really powerful. And I think that that's where that sense making comes in, and where I see it being a little bit different, where, not to get like real philosophical as an educator, but looking at sort of these like old education models that were very sort of teacher centric and sort of this like divide between teachers and students, versus looking at how I've always sort of aimed with education, where students are as empowered as the teachers, pulling on Paulo Freire and really these like sort of radical education models. I think that that's actually very similar to what's happening now, where, somebody we had Matt Leising, who's a crazy experienced journalist in the crypto space in our cohort. And while he wasn't an expert in forming a DAO, he certainly was an expert in some of these other fields. And so seeing this really wild organic model where so many projects are able to support each other, both within the cohort, and then this exponential power that we're going to have once we're a few cohorts out of the people who are going to be sitting on our bench, continuing to support the projects that are coming in. To me, that's why I'm incredibly bullish on this model, because I just see that massive scaling power that we're going to have, and the fact that we're arriving early. And so like as pioneers, not only do we have this growing deep bench, but it's filled with all of the early arrivers. And so knowing that we've got these veterans in the space that are going to then be supporting the next generation and the next generation, I don't know, who wouldn't want to be a part of that?
I feel this tension of being like, it's totally new and we're trying to build something totally new versus like, obviously there's a ton of examples of more, I guess, evolutionary growth rather than just like sparks of something brand new. But I think there is something majorly different when you're able to give ownership and build a network rather than the structures that sort of exist through something like Y Combinator. There's a tweet that I think I even have it pinned on my Twitter right now from Aaron Wright, who is a collaborator here at C Club, where he said DAOs are networks and networks are more valuable than companies. And I think that's going to prove out. I think many of us have like an insight on that, or at least a feeling that that's true, but probably something that's only going to be real as it's tested by time. That idea of value also extends down into like, yeah, not just like the value of a token, but like the value that a group of people can create together when they're sort of brought together through ownership in a network, which I think is interesting. And I always struggle to try to fully communicate the insight that I feel like we have there in a way that is broadly understandable. And truly, like, I think so much why I wanted to chat with you about this topic is because most people don't get the opportunity to experience like really what we do at C Club. They're sort of on the outside, and that is by design. You know, we really focus on creating a micro community feel in each of these cohorts. So there is that mutual support and trust, and we don't record these sessions. There's a lot of exploration and needing to be a safe space for that sort of exploration when you're talking about things like tokens. Truly, when you're in that room, it's very hard to sort of not be ridiculously excited about the types of value that these cohorts with a shared ownership and mission will be able to create. I just start talking about this stuff and I get really excited. So maybe try to think about how to guide this conversation effectively, because I think there's like recognizing that most people don't have an understanding exactly what goes on within the cohort. I think it's useful to sort of explore that, but then also really interested in thinking about how this is evolving, because so much of what we're doing is really, I know people hate that term of like building the tracks in front of the train, but I don't really know a better way of describing a lot of this stuff. And in fact, I think so much of the progress we're seeing in the space is people leaning into that and being okay with it being messy for a little while. Anyways, maybe that's a whole other conversation. But like, what should people expect from, like, if somebody's launching a DAO or has a DAO or maybe has a Web 2 community that wants to step into Web 3, what are the things that we are really focused on providing to those teams?
Yeah, so obviously I talked about sort of the ephemeral network and community that projects are in, but where does that actually happen and what does it look like? It happens, Zoom, all of the expected places. We're with each other 3 to 5 hours a week in various segments. And I think that we're exploring some IRL touch points, which I think we're seeing are incredibly important. But aside from that, we're together for 6 weeks. We come together 2 to 4 times as a group each time during that week. So we have 2 90-minute sessions that are scheduled that everybody is expected to be there for. At least one of them is definitely just a blow your mind, forget everything that you thought that you knew, completely sort of change your worldview type of drop-in talk with somebody from our network, whether early FWB pioneers like Trevor McFedries and Cooper Turley, exploring legal with Ruben Brahmanathan. I mean, so many incredible people that were on the bench. And quite frankly, like, that's when I saw that. That's when I realized that there was definitely something there with C Club. So bringing those people in to just really reframe how you're thinking about your projects and make you question things and perhaps disrupt any previously held beliefs. And then we sort of counterbalance that with something that's really tactical. So thinking about literally how are you going to onboard people into your community? What is that first touch point going to look like? Then what do you do with them? How do you keep them engaged? Or of course, looking at the super popular topic of token distribution, which is one of the most sought after questions for pretty much every single project, figuring out governance structures. So we both want to, theory and concept-wise, really expand our minds and show us that this tech really makes whole new ways of working together possible, but then also show you literally when you sit down at your computer, how are you going to interact with people and how are you going to do that? And then on top of that, like I said, there's these two other touch points that are really important where it's a bit more of a social many-to-many connection. And one of the things that I knew was true when I came out of our second cohort and in seeing it happen in our third cohort as well is the actual relationships, that those are perhaps one of the most valuable things that you take from the accelerator. So having one that's focused on a learning huddle that's led by projects, and then another session that's a little bit more social where projects are getting to know each other and just sharing wins and having a good time. And then the last thing that's probably one of the most important to mention are the wayfinders. And so every project is paired with somebody who is in your corner from day one through those 6 weeks and beyond. They're your biggest fan, they're your best resource, and they're the ones who are going to get you the tech questions answered. They're going to get you the intros that you need. They're going to be there to hype you up and to advise on your go-to-market and your hello world and all of those different pieces. We are rapidly working on building that base of wayfinders because we know that we're scaling up our accelerator, and ditto collaborator connection. So making sure that not only do you have somebody who is in your corner, but making sure you have a friend in high places in Web3, somebody who has seen a ton of projects come in and out and can give you their honest opinion based on months, if not years of time in crypto, which obviously counts for a lot. So yeah, I think that with all of those various touch points, it's high engagement for 6 weeks. Those 6 weeks fly by. I had the beautiful experience of on week 6 being in New York, where a lot of our projects were there for NFT NYC, and the vibes were just incredible. It felt like we'd been on this wild journey together, and then to see each other at the end of that road was really incredible.
Yeah, I think what a wonderful description of this. So I'm wondering, like, one of the questions people ask often is, are we just joining a class for 6 weeks, or is this more? And I think in your answer, you definitely sort of made it fairly clear that there's a lot more to it than teaching, and very much it's not this, here's the template for you to go run with. It's like a figuring out. And I think I've been trying to describe this as like us viewing it as a community DAOs as like the evolution of the startup rather than like an evolution of a membership site or a Patreon or something like that, where so much of the value that's being created isn't clearly understood early on. There's innovation and evolution, and we're seeing this sort of mix of like new community primitives and membership Legos that are being built in the Web3 space, along with like DeFi. I think a number of our projects are really leaning into interesting DeFi applications, and I think that's going to continue quite a bit. And so there's a ton of decisions that are being made that are leading to innovations that are positioning these teams in very unique ways. And nobody has really gone there before. So if we think about a couple big successes recently, right? One is Krause House. The decisions they are making to go build a community that's ultimately going to be in a position to buy and operate an NBA sports team are very different than, say, Water and Music, that is trying to build a research organization focused on appropriately rewarding people for the work they're putting into bringing knowledge to their community. And I think that even if there's probably room for 2 or 3 other teams to go and try to do those exact same things in different ways. And that's the thing that gets me really excited, as I think we've sort of moved away from early folks looking at this space as, social tokens equal betting on the future success of a creator, or it'll be just like a very simple template where you're going to token gate a Discord and sell membership tickets to it, and that's going to create the most value, to one where we're seeing brilliant founders, essentially project leaders, community leaders, come in and engage with this whole suite of new tools and opportunities and truly create something that I think we believe are venture scale and have massive value in the future. And I think we're increasingly seeing that being proven out, at least in the short term. But I mean, obviously, I'm a big believer in the long run. So I think that's maybe an important distinction, at least how I see the world there. But in that world, so much more of the value that gets created is, like, people come into the 6-week program, and as you said, it's like this fire hose, right? There's just like a lot going on. The hard work really starts afterwards. How are you thinking about describing like the value that we provide as an organization beyond the 6-week accelerator program?
I think that we help projects move into this new world, and once you see things a certain way, you can't unsee it. And so for me as a teacher, and even, as a parent now of 2 young kids going through school, I think a lot about how we learn and how we teach and how we provide information. And it's pretty wild working in the quote unquote future of work and thinking about how education is preparing us for this. And so the reason I bring that up is because I think it's very much not what specific thing can I teach you, but more how can I teach you how to learn in this way, where you're going to be eternally curious, where you're going to know how to learn within Web3 and how to ask the right questions and how to approach decisions thoughtfully. Because the reality of Web3 is that you're constantly going to be faced with these decisions that you don't necessarily know how to answer. But if you have some of the great advisors in your corner and in your network, or, perhaps one connection away, if you've trained these muscles to think differently, and so to think of your community as stakeholders and partners rather than as sort of a many-to-one audience connection or something like that. I think if we can provide these models and sort of retrain the way that we think and the way that we make decisions and the ways that we ask questions and research and problem solve and make sense together, then ultimately it's, when there's those two lines that they look parallel, but there's just like a teeny tiny one is a little bit off angle. And so when you start out, there's not that much deviation between the two lines. But if you just start on that path, once you're many miles down that line, you realize you're in a very different place. For me, like that's what the Accelerator is. We're teaching you how to learn and make sense of this space in a different way.
I love that. I watch you. One of your big goals being like, how do we just create the most ridiculous amount of value possible for teams that come through the Accelerator? And so again, that's like a more focused learning experience and collaboration experience. When our teams sort of launch into the world, right? They have tokens out in the world. They have a whole host of new challenges that they're exploring, right? And so many of like that's truly, I think, the edge of this space right now, where even many of the folks that we have deep in our corner that have done this before are still actively learning on. And I definitely consider us being in the same boat, where the conversations quickly move from like, how do I structure this and distribute it, stand it up, frame it, communicate it, to the operations of these. And there's a lot of mess in the operations right now. We step into governance, we start stepping into hiring and compensating, rewarding work, things like liquidity and tools and development. And these communities are truly operating like they are, startups with many participants in them rather than running a Facebook group or the like. And so I think that's like when I think about like how we continue to evolve the value that we create, that's really where most of my mind is sort of focused. And I think it's going to be really interesting to see how we as a network can continue to support and create that long-term value. Because, what's so interesting with our model is a small percentage of one of these networks early on is just not that valuable, generally speaking, right? If the vast majority of the value that if we're successful in creating these community DAOs will be created in the future. And so we need to be effective at supporting the growth of these projects beyond. And, big part of our decision criteria and how we look at projects that we're working with is looking at a 5-year, 10-year time horizon, not just a 5-month time horizon. I don't have great answers. I mean, I think the way that we are solving these problems right now is like our broader collaborator network is deeply engaged with the projects that are trying to, that folks are figuring out liquidity. What's the right way to incentivize liquidity? Should we incentivize liquidity? Should we own liquidity? What does that mean? Really exciting. And we see I think big opportunities to lead and build templates there and build products there, which is, I think, exciting. And then more on like I think Sherry Hugh from Water and Music said Web3 is less about tech and more about people, paraphrasing obviously, but I think she's specifically talking about problems and like the idea of thinking through how do you enroll people in this mission? How do you compensate them appropriately? How do you compensate them when you have a token price that's moving all over the place? Like, what does that mean? And, how do you then, properly operate these things in, there's a lot of work that's been done in thinking through how do you run decentralized organizations but there is the sense of there being something different and something new in this exploration. And so that's really where I think this value of the network is going to really play out. It's going to be impossible for a small team, a firm, to be able to really effectively support a growing network of communities that are doing so many different things. And truly the only way for us to create the sort of value we want to create as an organization is to lean into this network, to lean into and build these social connections, so that the vast majority of the value that's being created is project to project, or community, people in communities to other people in communities, rather than from, say, C Club to communities. But geez, that's like such a big space, right?
It would seem foolish to me to try to anticipate the questions that our projects are going to have in 2 years, but I'm confident that the roadmap that we're on and the path that we're on will have the people within our community and on our bench that know the answers to those questions. While I can't anticipate where the space is going to be in that 2-year mark, and that seems like a poor use of my time, I think that where I devote is to just completely over-deliver right now to where we're at, and think about how those projects can come out of Seed Club feeling that this was worth the 6 weeks, it was worth this commitment, and that they want to give back to that space and stay engaged and continue to share their learnings. And then, in 2 years, when we have new big questions that we can't even imagine now, then we'll have those veterans that we can, we'll have the Krause House, and we'll have Sherry and all of those leaders who we can then lean on. And I mean, like, I can't imagine. It's pretty exciting thinking about where they're going to be in 2 years. Like, that's wild.
So when I talk about to builders who are building tech in the space, I get really excited because we were seeing a big shift from 6 months ago where people were building, or 6 months to, a long time ago, where people were building tech and trying to convince people to come use it. And now we have users, small amount, but we have users. And so people are building tech for those users. So whether they be DAOs or people operating DAOs. And so I think so much of the opportunity I see as being part of Seed Club is to be at the front row seat of these problems being identified and tackled in different ways, and that collective knowledge being created so that you can run faster, both with the product teams that we work with. That's an immense amount of value, and that they can build for products, but also for, I think, leaders within these communities, where the collective knowledge of, like, how much should I pay somebody who's coming in at this stage? How do we collectively make that decision and build a legitimacy to do that? Yeah, you're right. There's going to be a billion more questions, but being first to those questions, or at least early to those questions, maybe not first, but early to those questions, I think is huge. And then it's up to us, I think, as a community to think through how do we build the infrastructure to be able to support the solving of those problems, and then, like, disseminate those lessons to our broader network. Which maybe that's the interesting thing, thinking through how the shift of, because I think we talk, like I always say, the Accelerator is the core to Seed Club, but that's very quickly might actually not be the case, right? Because Accelerator is dealing with maybe the early stage projects, which right now we're maybe 15, 16, 18, 20 projects that we're working with at a time. And we're 2 cohorts in, or 3 cohorts in. When we're 10 cohorts in, that Accelerator is going to look like a very small part of our broader ecosystem. And for us to lean into continuing creating value for our broader ecosystem, I feel like your job's just going to get a lot wider, Nicole. You're just going to do all the things.
I mean, yeah, I always say when you're holding a hammer, everything looks like a nail. And yeah, when you're an educator, everything looks like learning. But yeah, I think that that's a really important point to bring up. So while I keep on talking about how the core and the value of the Accelerator and of Seed Club is this networked community that looks like some type of fractal or Beautiful Minds Venn, I think that it is important to mention that we're committed to bringing those learnings out as well. And so that's another whole piece of the work that I get to do with some really incredible folks in our community, of thinking about how do we share those learnings out. And quite frankly, I think that's a big piece of this as a space, as a Web3 ecosystem. That's a big space of the accelerated knowledge base and sense making that we're all doing. The ability for this entire community of people building in Web3 to get to this sort of shared galaxy brain really quickly through podcasts and, mirror posts and all of the content that we're consuming is really key. And so I think that we feel that it's really important for us to be part of that knowledge share. And so as we're having those learning moments within the Accelerator, and as our projects are first arrivers to some really hard problems and then first solvers to those really hard problems, we think it's really important to highlight them, to highlight their journey, and to highlight the learnings from their journey. And so obviously the audience for that is not just the Accelerator, but it's the community that radiates out from the Accelerator as well. So that's a piece that I'm really excited about and really committed. We have a digest that should be just about live from our second cohort. Another one's going to be coming out from our third cohort where we can see a little bit about the projects. And then on top of that, these sort of topical case studies and deep dives into issues that, I think everybody's wondering and thinking about, from how do you go about setting up your wallet as a community? When you go from yourself and you're the main person leading the community all of a sudden into needing to set up a multi-sig, and it seems really tactical and silly, but the order that you do those things in and that you interface with all of the various Web3 tools is really important. And so I think being able to spell out really granular things like that, and then of course, some of the quote unquote people problems like Sherry was referring to, I think are also really key of how do you bring your community in. Obviously the episode that you just had with David Spinks, there was so many great tactical suggestions there. So bringing out those learnings and sharing them to the wider ecosystem is also something that Seed Club will be doing.
Okay. So I'm curious, when you sort of project out into 5 years, which is like such an absurd thing to do in this space generally, but I mean, it's kind of a fun daydream every once in a while just to see like how where our brain goes. Where do you see Seed Club and maybe more specifically like the work we're doing with our accelerator in 5 years?
Gosh, I mean, I think that I'm just blown away at the privilege of getting to work with creators. For example, the dancers and the artists within Heat DAO. I think that that's one that's flying a little bit under the radar as far as what it's going to be and the impact that it's going to have. And, so the ability to capture movement data and to bring it into interoperable metaverses. I think the power of some of these communities hasn't even seen their moment. And so I think 5 years from now, seeing these big, FAANG conglomerates fade to the back and seeing communities being able to compete on equal footing is where I'd like to see. And for Seed Club to have a meaningful hand in that, I think early on sort of played around with the metaphors of seeds and of planting all of these different seeds. And so I think that is a big part of what we're doing, is planting all of these seeds that are ultimately going to really challenge what the power dynamic looks like for creators and for communities. And so for Seed Club to have a hand in that, I think ultimately is just such a privilege.
Yeah, I love that. So obviously I share the optimism and hope and the excitement, and I think it's a crazy privilege to be in a position where we're at right now, to be able to have the trust of these like phenomenal human beings that are investing so much of themselves in these big visions that they've either been working on for many years in some cases or are really leaning into hard right now. And so I think like one of the things that I love so much about how you approach your work here is just like the reverence and level of giving a shit that you have for supporting these folks. And I think that's like the thing that I hope, if we zoom out 5 years in the future, that we've built a community that holds people at its core and long-term minded focus at the core, and that we're not pulled into some of like the short-term games that I think are very difficult to navigate in the crypto space as there's so much money floating around. And instead we have focused on supporting amazing people with their big visions and dreams, and can also point to a host of wild successes, whether that's DAOs that are worth billions and billions of dollars, or it's DAOs that have changed, the environment in a certain way or had a social impact in a certain way. My hope is we see all of those, and we're not just measuring ourselves by value that gets created there. And I think that vibe is going to be super key. And two things that have kind of shocked me over the last little while. One was like how many people know about Seed Club and are so excited to talk to you or myself on these live streams that we're doing around this, which I love because it just kind of shows how much excitement there is around the space. But two was out of our demo day that we did 3 weeks ago now, where people were just shocked about the vibes. I think there's this idea of almost like it feeling like, our teams didn't show up to pitch VCs. They showed up to share their visions and their passion with the community. And it led to a very, I think it was non-douchey, I believe was one of like the quotes that came out of the chat.
That's my goal always, 100%.
Yeah, well, you keep name dropping like bands that you go see on the weekend that I've never ever heard of, but I'm like, okay, that must mean it's super cool. So I know you got to send me links, Nicole. I don't know, I don't know who any of those people are. I'm Canadian. It makes no sense.
Definitely am. Yeah.
So one of the things that I think I'm very guilty of, and I find this tension of hard to navigate, where both I feel like I see a vision and I want to articulate that and get people excited about it and create space for others to kind of be a part of that. And so there's sort of this like lean into optimism quite a bit, but also like I think as we sort of alluded to, there's a lot of practical challenges. The whole purpose behind our organization is recognizing there are incredible practical challenges and actually being able to build and launch these things that we need to go solve, and that, solving that as a team or a community or a network is the way to go do that. But I think it's important for us to like articulate the challenges clearly. It's even more important now as more and more people are sort of getting excited and waking up to the potential of DAOs, and sort of that early adopter, early majority are coming into the space. And it's probably easy to give people the wrong impression of like the current state of the tools and the tech and the understanding, etc. So if there was sort of like words of caution or things that maybe we should be aware of as we continue these conversations, or definitely our listeners should be aware that we're aware of, like, what do you think those big areas to flag are?
Well, I really appreciated Jonathan Mann's song a day. I think it was today or yesterday, which was Too Many Discords. And if you haven't seen the video, you should definitely check it out. It's awesome. So yeah, I think that Discord is both a blessing and a curse. And it's not only that there's too many, but that once you get in, you want to have a meaningful impact and know that you're in the right place. And so that's an obvious one, I think, but I don't think it can be overstated. The financial accessibility is really important to mention, and that really fluctuates with the market as well, which is even more challenging to explain, that on some days it's a little bit more financially accessible than others, depending on what gas fees are. And so I think that within some communities, I think gas fees get talked about more than others, but I think that that's an important piece to just mention, as far as that's an element of the work that we do on chain. And I think going back to explain why that is philosophically and the work that's being done around it is important to educate, that it is something that sort of this whole concept is built on, that there's people really thoughtfully trying to problem solve around it, and also that it's just a thing right now and it does have an impact, and resources are finite, especially for some people. So I think that that's a really important piece to mention. Yeah, and then I think that the building slow and thoughtfully, and the moving over for a lot of projects and for communities going from Web 2 to Web 3, not assuming that it's going to just be this like really easy port from place to place, that you're going to just go from one spot and move your group over, like, I don't know, moving a house on a flatbed or something like that. That's just not the way it works. And so that this slow, thoughtful building can still be really successful. And I think we've seen it, Protein and Jump are two examples where we've seen them bring communities into Web3 and be really intentional about it. Eve Wealth is doing the same thing, to go slow and steady. So yeah, I mean, these are things that we're experiencing day to day when you bring people into your Discord, making sure that there's ways that they can contribute so that you can keep really great talent. I think that we definitely see people coming in who are amazing and finding ways to make sure that they can lean in and have the freedom and space to provide value and know how they're going to provide value and be compensated. There's definitely, I mean, yeah, there's so many challenges. I'll definitely wake up some days and realize that I've had some crazy dreams about like Web3 Web3 issues, and be like, was that real life or was I dreaming?
Yeah, I think it's there's a whole wealth of tactical challenges. You talked about the accessibility as a big one, which I think is so important. We talk about ownership, and I think that's like the key difference. Like if you hold a Bitcoin, you own 1/21 millionth of the Bitcoins that will ever exist. And there's sort of the sense of ownership in the network. To me, that's at least where I go when I try to describe why Web3 is so different, right? It's like ownership, digital ownership, or property rights in a digital world. But there's still like a lot of fuzziness around that concept. And so to me, that's a thing that we also need to be aware of and thoughtful of. And I'm very much speaking to myself here, where to me, like Jesse Walden and the ownership economy was the perfect articulation of why I had been, my early interest in crypto. and also recognizing that the mechanisms we have to distribute ownership, like the true sort of legal rights or whatever that needs to be to like truly represent ownership, and then also like the importance of voice and say and impact that ownership can represent. I think we just aren't doing, like, we're not where we need to be there generally as a space. Token weighted voting that gives whales more power than individuals who might be actually creating value in the network is like, I think we know this. It's definitely not like these are critiques that I think are fair and important to keep in mind, and also are noted and talked about often, etc. But I think through the lens of like making sure that I'm being thoughtful to communicate like the edges of this stuff, ownership and what that actually means is like a really big one for me.
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's also something that is not always talked about with the transparency that you just had, for example, around token weighted voting versus quadratic versus one wallet, one vote, or one member, one vote, and what implication all of those have. And I think that there is, I mean, you talked about this at the very beginning, this tension between sort of wanting to reject all things skeuomorphic, but then at the same time, not reinventing wheels. And so I think also recognizing that there are things to learn from past community experiments and past community ownership experiments that happened before Web3, and that while we think that we're in a new space, these concepts, there are some foundations and some rules, whether it's in old co-op or just sort of general like mutual aid and other really basic fundamental communities, intentional communities. People have been doing this and thinking about this for a long time. We just now have these tools that allow us to do this across digital realms in a way that's a lot more transparent and scalable. And so, yeah, I think that it's very challenging. And I think that there are clear, race and gender power dynamics that sort of overlay on top of that for a newcomer who doesn't necessarily have like the financial or like identity privileges that all of those things afford, it can feel really hard to like even ask the question, much less challenge an assumption of, okay, well, why are decisions being made with this type of voting mechanism versus the other? It may be hard to even understand where you find that information and whether that's something that's up for debate, whether it's something that you are privy to.
I think just speaks to how early all this stuff is, which is maybe deemed as an unfair comment often if you think we've been, building blockchains have been around for, more than a decade, but I still think, it's still so incredibly early. The thing that I'm most excited about is just that how much more momentum there is this time around, and people are actually building, and users, and I think communities are where adoption happens and where a lot of those conversations can be had, or at least they're more likely to be had there. I think we're seeing, the tools being accessible to more communities, and so there are more communities existing. Like the growth in learning communities in Web3 has just been so wonderful to see, and hope we see thousands more. But yeah, I always come back to like pragmatic approaches to actually building is the thing that I want to support within the space. And even though it's imperfect and we don't have all the answers and it's going to go wrong, that's the right way for us to move forward. It's like 1,000 seeds. Let's see what actually sticks, and hopefully embedded with the right intention of like long-term mindedness, respecting human beings within these systems. But I think this is going to be a wild few months. It's been a wild few months, 6 months, Nicole. Giddy up. Let's go. Your half-year anniversary.
Woo woo.
And just imagine what the next 6 years are. So I worry that we're just going to get into talking forever, as we like to do around some of these more esoteric topics, which maybe some people will like. I think if you're listening right now, you probably like it because you're still with us. So congratulations to you. But I'm curious, I think you have sort of a window into what I love about our conversations is like you sort of look into a part of the Web3 space that I'm not deeply involved in. And so I wonder if maybe you want to share a couple communities or links or places where you're like actively engaged in updating your view of the world, so that we can maybe direct some people to those places rather than just listening to where I hang out all the time.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the sort of Web3 space that I probably spend the most time other than C Club is Songcamp and Electra. I got indoctrinated into the music industry when I started working at Berkeley, and I just can't quit it. And like you said, the way that Matthew was designing and thinking about Songcamp, I just saw that and it was just immediately, yeah, this guy gets it. The way that he's going about problem solving is something I've never seen before in this intersection of music and crypto. And then Electra, which spun out of Songcamp, really just blew my mind in such a fun way. And so it's hard to even explain, but he took his community members, both his builders and the people that got involved, on this interplanetary narrative puzzle live action game where we had to use different NFTs that we would earn to put together and solve riddles and then ultimately save this land called Electra. And so now that that's over, we're thinking about what the future of Electra is and what kinds of stories and adventures we're going to take people on next and get people involved in. And for me, the reason that Electra feels really powerful is because the people at the center are artists and builders, or, builder artists, artist devs, dev artists. It's this combination. And I think one of the things that makes me most bullish about Web3 period is that the line between devs and artists is becoming increasingly blurred. And that's something that I've always just felt very important, that, tech should be built in partnership and in mind with the people and the users that are going to ultimately be using it. And so with Electra, I get to be right at the front row of that and just get to collaborate with a bunch of really creative and fun and thoughtful community members. And I do think that that combination of live action gaming and role playing mixed with music and creativity and visuals and puzzles, I think that those models are going to be a really fun way to onboard people into Web3 and give them something to actually do rather than, obviously I like to wax poetic about social tokens and DAOs, but I think most people want to have fun in a different way. And so I think that this combination of music and gaming and adventure is going to be a big way that people can have fun in Web3 without even realizing that they're in Web3.
I love it. Shout out to Songcamp crew, big plans over there. That entire thing started when Matt bought one of our first NFTs that we listed from C Club for unlocking one of the events we did early on, the Creator Crypto Summit. And he was on a call and I'm like, well, what do you want to promote? Like, you get to promote something at the end of the session. And he's like, I don't know. It's kind of like thinking about maybe this thing. And I was like, heck yes, that's the thing. And
I love it.
Yeah, been very wild to see. It's just so much fun, Nicole. So much fun. Okay. Thank you for spending time with me today again for the 400th time, but with us, I guess, collectively as the Club podcast listeners. One of my missions in life is to make sure that the world is aware of your brilliance, because I think your Twitter game you're not putting the same focus on your Twitter game as you are putting on our Accelerator, which, for the record, I am appreciative of, because you got no shortage of things to do over there. But where can people find you on the internet?
So yeah, I'm on Twitter. I am my Bella Logica, which certainly was not written with discoverability in mind many years ago. But yeah, I'm on Twitter and on Discord pretty much all the time, C Club Discord. So find me there.
Yeah, and Nicole and I are hosting live chats every Friday morning, 10 a.m. Pacific, I guess afternoon, 1 p.m. Eastern for you, where we're encouraging teams that are interested in joining or exploring if SCO4 is a fit for them to come make themselves known, share a little bit about what they're working on. It's also a place to ask questions about C Club and about the Accelerator directly to Nicole or myself. So we'd love to have you join us there. And of course, you can follow Nicole once you join that Twitter Spaces. So that's C Club HQ every Friday morning or afternoon, depending where you are in the world, at 10 a.m. Pacific and 1 Eastern. Nicole, appreciate you hanging out with us. I'm sure I'm going to see you in like 20 minutes again anyways, but
thanks, Jess.
Thank you on behalf of our listeners for sharing, I guess, a bit of a window into the fun things we've been working on, but I'm assuming it's going to look a bit different next time we have this conversation. So, and also I'm really excited to bring more people into C Club. You know how cool that's going to be as we can start to open these doors a little bit more. I mean, you do. I mean, we do. I mean, maybe you don't as a listener here, but it's going to be awesome.
It's happening.
Awesome.
It's happening.
Awesome.
It's happening.